My ex-husband sent me a wedding invitation just to humiliate me. He specifically wrote that economy tickets were cheap enough for me to afford, hoping I would show up to witness his massive upgrade. His mother even chimed in, mocking my supposed infertility in front of their entire extended family. What they did not know was that I was not showing up alone. I was bringing the 3 5-year-old children he threw away and a single piece of paper that would turn his $1 million wedding into a crime scene. I am Lauren, 33 years old, and today I run a highly successful forensic data auditing firm. But to my ex-husband and his family, I am just the pathetic, barren starter wife they discarded 5 years ago. Before I dive into exactly how I destroyed his perfect day, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain while secretly plotting your ultimate comeback. The notification lit up my phone on a quiet Tuesday evening. It was from the Family Updates group chat, a digital space I had somehow never been removed from after the divorce. For 5 years, I had kept the chat on mute, ignoring the endless photos of family vacations, holiday dinners, and eventually the announcements of Jason dating a new woman. Courtney was 28, the daughter of a major tech chief executive officer, and exactly the kind of shiny trophy Jason had always believed he deserved. I unlocked my screen and read the message Jason had just sent to all 32 members of the extended family. Lauren, he wrote, tagging me directly so I would not miss it. Courtney and I are getting married next month at the Pelican Hill Resort in California. We know things are probably tight for you, but economy tickets are not that expensive right now. You should really come. It might do you some good to see what a real functioning family looks like. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his message, another text popped up. It was from Barbara, my ex-mother-in-law. Jason is right, Lauren, she wrote. Courtney is already such a wonderful stepmother to Jason's 4-year-old son from his previous relationship. Hopefully you have finally gotten over your infertility issues enough to come bless my son's true happiness. Do not be bitter. We would love to see you. I let out a slow, steady breath. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone across the room. The days of letting Barbara and Jason dictate my emotional state were long gone. I simply looked up from my kitchen island and surveyed my living room. Across the sprawling expanse of my downtown penthouse, my 5-year-old triplets were busy building a massive block tower. Leo had Jason's exact jawline. Mason had his unruly brown hair. And Riley, the sharpest of the three, had my eyes but Jason's unmistakable, infuriatingly arrogant smirk. They were laughing, tumbling over each other in a pile of limbs and joy. When Jason walked out on me 5 years ago, he packed his golf clubs into his luxury car and handed me a stack of divorce papers at a crowded coffee shop. He left me with $50,000 of his hidden credit card debt and the parting insult that my barren womb was ruining his life trajectory. He told me he needed a woman who could give him a legacy, not a sterile liability. What Jason did not know, and what I never gave him the satisfaction of finding out, was that I had a doctor appointment later that very same afternoon. The ultrasound revealed that my supposed infertility was actually a high-risk triplet pregnancy. I sat in my beat-up sedan in the clinic parking lot, holding the ultrasound printout, and made the defining choice of my life. I chose silence. I knew that if I told Jason, he would either demand I terminate the pregnancy because it ruined his bachelor lifestyle, or his controlling mother Barbara would try to trap me in their toxic dynamic forever. He wanted to be free to chase status and wealth, and I was not about to tie myself and my unborn children to a man who treated marriage like a disposable stepping stone. I took the debt. I took the humiliation. I took the pain. While Jason spent the next 5 years climbing the corporate ladder and courting a billionaire's daughter, I worked 20-hour days. I raised 3 infants while building a forensic accounting firm from my tiny apartment. I tracked digital footprints, audited corporate mergers, and exposed offshore accounts for major corporations. I turned my absolute despair into a multi-million-dollar empire, all in complete and utter silence. My phone buzzed again, breaking my train of thought. It was Richard, my ex-father-in-law, adding his voice to the group chat. Lauren, it is a black tie event. We can chip in for a cheap motel room nearby if you cannot afford the resort fees. We just want no hard feelings. No hard feelings. They wanted an audience. They wanted the discarded, supposedly broke, childless ex-wife to sit in the back row and marvel at Jason's monumental success. They wanted me to be the punchline of their cocktail hour, a pathetic contrast to Courtney's youthful perfection and immense wealth. They thought they had invited a victim to their slaughter. I picked up my phone, my perfectly manicured thumbs flying across the screen with chilling precision. I did not type an angry paragraph. I did not defend myself. I leaned into their delusion completely. "Thank you for the invitation, Jason," I typed. "And thank you, Barbara, for your concern about my medical history. I would not miss this for the world. I have prepared a wedding gift that you will absolutely never forget." I hit send and watched the little read receipts pop up one by one. I locked my phone and set it face down on the cool marble counter. "Riley," I called out. My daughter popped her head up from behind the fallen block tower, her dark curls bouncing. "Yes, Mommy. How would you guys like to go on an airplane next month?" I asked, walking over to them and crouching down to their eye level. "We are going to a very big party in California." "Is there going to be cake?" Mason asked, scrambling to his feet with wide eyes. "Oh, there is going to be everything," I said, a slow, icy smile touching my lips. "And Mommy has a very special job for you, Riley. Do you want to practice?" Riley's eyes lit up. At 5 years old, her reading level was off the charts, and she loved nothing more than memorizing lines from her favorite audiobooks and television shows. She had a dramatic flair that was entirely her own. "I want to practice," she cheered, clapping her hands together. "Good girl," I said, standing up and walking over to my leather briefcase resting on the entryway table. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with a red legal stamp. I walked back and handed it to my tiny, innocent daughter. "When we get to the party, I am going to point to a man in a tuxedo. You are going to walk straight up to him, hand him this envelope, and say the exact words we practice. Can you do that for Mommy?" Riley gripped the envelope tightly, nodding with utmost seriousness. "I can do it, Mommy." "Perfect," I whispered, smoothing her hair. "Let Jason have his black tie wedding. Let Barbara parade around in her overpriced gown mocking my empty womb. Let Richard offer to pay for my cheap motel." They wanted a grand spectacle, and I was fully prepared to deliver the grand finale. I had 30 days to ensure every trap was set, every document was verified, and every escape route for Jason was firmly bolted shut. The countdown to the wedding had officially begun. The next morning, I sat behind the mahogany desk in my corner office. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the downtown skyline, a reminder of everything I had built. Vanguard Data Solutions occupied the entire top floor. It was a fortress of glass and silence. I sipped my coffee and opened my laptop. An email notification slid across the top right corner of my screen. The sender was an unfamiliar address, but the subject line made the author obvious. Saturday dress code information. I clicked it open. It was from Courtney. "Hi, Lauren," the email began. "Jason told me you are actually planning to attend our wedding. I have to say that is so brave of you. Just a quick heads up, my father is hosting the reception at his private country club, and the dress code is strictly high-fashion black tie. Jason mentioned that things have been pretty tight for you financially since the divorce. I know it can be intimidating to be around people of a certain caliber. If you do not have the budget for a proper evening gown, please let me know. I have some old bridesmaid dresses taking up space in my closet that I was going to drop off at a charity bin. I would be happy to overnight one to you. I just do not want you to feel embarrassed when you stand next to my family. See you soon. Courtney." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and let out a dry, humorless chuckle. The condescension practically dripped from the pixels on my monitor. She was 28 years old, entirely funded by her father's massive technology empire, and currently playing house with a man who had actively ruined my credit score to buy himself a luxury watch. Instead of getting angry, I simply forwarded the email to my personal archive folder. Let her believe I was struggling. Let her believe I would show up in a cheap, outdated dress, shrinking into the background while she paraded around in custom couture. It was funny how oblivious they were. They thought the last 5 years of my life had been spent wallowing in misery, pining over a man who treated me like garbage. The truth was brutal and vastly more rewarding. When Jason walked out, I had $400 and $50,000 in joint debt he secretly racked up. 2 weeks later, my doctor confirmed the triplets. The sheer panic I felt that day could have crushed me. I remember sitting on the floor of my empty living room staring at my belly, realizing I was entirely alone. I had two choices. I could crawl back to Jason, beg for help, and subject myself and my children to Barbara's psychological abuse. Or I could go to war with the world. I chose war. I used my last savings to buy a refurbished laptop and specialized accounting software. Before Jason, I had a talent for identifying financial anomalies. I knew how to follow the money. I took freelance auditing jobs for local businesses. I worked late into the night, typing with one hand while holding a crying infant with the other. When Leo, Mason, and Riley were born, the exhaustion reached an entirely new level. There were months where I averaged 2 hours of sleep a night. I would rock Mason to sleep with my foot while analyzing bank statements on my monitor. I would feed Riley her bottle while cross-referencing offshore tax havens for my clients. I took the pain of Jason's abandonment and turned it into fuel. I became relentless. My ability to track hidden assets and uncover corporate fraud quickly caught the attention of larger firms. Within 2 years, Vanguard Data Solutions was born. I hired a team of elite analysts. I moved out of that cramped apartment and into the penthouse. I paid off Jason's debt with a single wire transfer and never looked back. Jason had spent those same 5 years doing what he did best, leeching off the success of others. He climbed the corporate ladder not through hard work, but through aggressive networking, taking credit for his colleagues' ideas and eventually attaching himself to Courtney. He saw her father's company Apex Tech as his golden ticket to the elite circles he had always felt entitled to. To Jason, Courtney was not a partner, she was an acquisition. And Courtney, wrapped in her bubble of inherited wealth, was completely blind to his true nature. Her email was just a reflection of the narrative Jason had fed her. He had painted me as the pathetic, barren ex-wife who could not keep up with his ambition. He needed her to look down on me so she would never suspect that he was the actual parasite in the relationship. It was a classic manipulation tactic. Isolate the target, inflate your own worth, and diminish everyone else. I looked at the email one last time before closing the window. I did not need her charity dresses. I had already commissioned custom-tailored outfits for Leo, Mason, and Riley from a boutique in Paris. And for myself, I had selected a stunning midnight blue gown that cost more than Jason's first car. I wanted to look impeccable when I delivered my gift. I picked up my pen and tapped it thoughtfully against my desk. The private threat Courtney thought she was making was nothing compared to the storm I was bringing. She wanted to shame me into submission. She wanted to establish dominance before I even set foot on the resort property. But you cannot intimidate someone who holds the blueprint to your entire downfall. My assistant knocked on my glass door, interrupting my thoughts. She stepped in and handed me a thick, sealed folder. "The latest financial logs you requested from the Apex Tech merger file," she said. "Thank you so much," I replied very calmly. "This is exactly what I need now." I waited for the heavy glass door to click shut before breaking the seal on the folder. The embossed logo of Apex Tech stared back at me, crisp and authoritative. 6 weeks ago, the chief executive officer of Apex Tech, Courtney's billionaire father, had retained my firm under a strict non-disclosure agreement. He needed a discreet, ruthless audit of a smaller firm his empire was absorbing. That smaller firm was precisely where Jason currently worked as the vice president of acquisitions. It was a beautiful, poetic twist of fate. The billionaire was paying me top dollar to investigate his future son-in-law, entirely unaware that the lead auditor he hired was the very woman his daughter was currently mocking via email. I spread the printed financial logs across my expansive desk, cross-referencing them with the digital spreadsheets illuminating my dual monitors. For a man who loved to flaunt his superior intellect, Jason was remarkably sloppy with his digital footprint. During our brief marriage, he constantly belittled my career, calling my early accounting work glorified arithmetic. He always believed he was the smartest person in any room. That arrogance was exactly what blinded him to his own vulnerabilities. He assumed nobody would look closely at the tedious acquisition reports. He was entirely and catastrophically wrong. I pulled up the transaction histories covering the past 18 months. This timeline aligned perfectly with the exact duration of his courtship and engagement to Courtney. I ran Vanguard's proprietary predictive algorithm through his department's funding accounts. The software immediately flagged a series of recurring, highly suspicious anomalies. Large sums of money carefully disguised as external consulting fees and vendor payouts were being systematically bled from the corporate acquisition funds. Jason had personally authorized 32 separate transfers to a newly registered holding company under the name Blue Horizon Consulting. I clicked my mouse, digging deeper into the International Corporate Registry database. Blue Horizon Consulting was not a legitimate vendor offering actual services. It was a ghost entity, a classic shell company set up with a registered agent who did not actually exist. I traced the routing numbers attached to the shell company. The financial trail bypassed standard domestic banking regulations, weaving through a series of encrypted offshore nodes. With a few keystrokes, I broke through the basic routing layers. The money landed securely in a private numbered offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Jason was not just skimming off the top, he was orchestrating a massive systematic theft. I highlighted the final column on my screen and hit the sum function. The total embezzled amount stared back at me in bold, unforgiving green numbers. $4.2 million. Jason was stealing directly from his future father-in-law to fund the lavish lifestyle he was currently parading around in front of me. The massive diamond engagement ring currently sitting on Courtney's finger, the down payment on their sprawling new suburban mansion, the custom-tailored designer tuxedo he would wear this coming Saturday, all of it was purchased with stolen money. I leaned back in my chair and interlaced my fingers, letting the sheer magnitude of his stupidity wash over me. He had built his entire new life on a fragile foundation of easily provable corporate fraud. If Courtney's father knew that his prospective son-in-law was treating the company coffers like a personal piggy bank, the wedding would be the least of Jason's problems. He would be facing federal embezzlement charges, asset seizure, and potentially decades in federal prison. I downloaded the entire transaction history, complete with IP addresses, matching Jason's work terminal, onto a secure encrypted flash drive. I did not just have evidence. I had a loaded weapon, and I was going to hand it directly to the chief executive officer at the wedding reception. But his inevitable corporate ruin was only the second phase of my ultimate master plan. I picked up my desk phone and dialed my lead attorney. Oliver answered on the second ring, his tone sharp and ready. "Do you have the final calculations?" I asked, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Yes," Lauren Oliver replied briskly. "I took the updated salary figures you provided, including his fraudulent executive bonuses. We calculated the child support arrears for the 3 children over the span of the last 5 years. Factoring in maximum penalty fees and compound interest for willful evasion, the total back pay owed is exactly $1.8 million. Have you secured the judge's signature?" I asked, pulling up the digital copy of the legal summons on my screen. "Signed and sealed this morning," Oliver confirmed. "It is an official court summons and an immediate lien against all his known domestic bank accounts. Once he is served, his assets will be frozen instantly. Are you absolutely sure you want to serve him personally at the wedding? Hiring a professional process server would be the standard legal procedure. Standard procedure does not apply to a man who abandons his unborn children." "Oliver," I replied smoothly, "I want him to look directly into the eyes of the child he threw away, while his entire financial reality shatters around him. Make sure the physical documents are couriered to my office by noon tomorrow. I have a 5-year-old courier who is fully prepared for the job." I hung up the phone slowly and looked out over the sprawling city lights below. Jason genuinely thought he had won the game. He thought he could discard me, erase his children from existence, and step into a life of elite privilege without facing a single consequence. He assumed my silence over the past 5 years was proof of my absolute defeat. He never realized that silence is just the sound of someone building an inescapable ambush. I carefully placed the encrypted flash drive into my designer handbag. The dress code for Saturday was high-fashion black tie, but I was dressing for a highly calculated corporate execution. My private cell phone vibrated across the polished mahogany desk, shattering the quiet focus of my office. The caller identification displayed a familiar name. I picked up the device and pressed it to my ear. Jamal was on the line. He was my former sister-in-law, Emily's husband, a 34-year-old architectural genius, and the only person in Jason's family who possessed an actual moral compass. As a successful African-American man who had married into their pretentious status-obsessed circle just a year prior to my divorce, Jamal understood exactly what it felt like to be constantly judged by Barbara's impossible, highly prejudiced standards. We had formed a quiet alliance early on, bound by our shared endurance of their toxic dynamics. "Lauren, tell me you are not actually coming to this circus on Saturday," Jamal said. His voice echoed slightly, indicating he had retreated to a tiled bathroom just to make this phone call in secret. "I am absolutely attending, Jamal," I replied smoothly, organizing the legal summons into a pristine leather folder. "I already confirmed my flight." "You need to cancel it," he insisted, his tone thick with genuine anger. "Emily and I just finished enduring a grueling brunch with Barbara, Richard, and Jason. They were finalizing the seating arrangements for the reception, and I saw exactly what they did to your name. They are setting a trap for you, Lauren. They want you there purely for their own cruel entertainment. It is completely sick." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "Tell me about the seating chart, Jamal. I want to hear every detail." He let out a heavy sigh, the frustration evident in his breathing. "They put you at table 14. It is not even in the main dining area. It is shoved into the service corridor annex, right next to the swinging kitchen doors where the waitstaff keeps the dirty bus tubs. Barbara explicitly requested that location. I heard her telling the wedding planner that you were socially awkward and needed to be completely hidden away from Courtney's high-profile guests. She actually laughed and said they did not want the barren ex-wife depressing the mood of the real families in attendance. Jason thought it was the funniest joke he had ever heard. I did not react to the insult. The sting of Barbara's venom had lost its potency the day I realized my net worth had eclipsed her entire family's generational wealth by a factor of 10. I smiled at the sheer tactical advantage of her petty decision. "Table 14 sounds absolutely lovely," I said, my voice remaining as placid as a frozen lake. "It provides a highly strategic vantage point. I will have a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the main stage and immediate access to the service exits. It is perfect." "Lauren, are you listening to me?" Jamal demanded, his voice rising in disbelief. "You survived that awful family. You got away from Jason and built a life for yourself. You do not need to subject yourself to this level of public humiliation. Jason has been drinking expensive scotch all week, bragging to anyone who will listen about how seeing you sitting alone in a cheap dress is going to be the ultimate wedding gift. He wants to crush you in front of his new corporate friends." I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the bustling city traffic far below. "Have I ever done anything in the last 5 years without a highly calculated reason, Jamal?" There was a heavy pause on the line. Jamal was an architect. He understood the necessity of a solid foundation and the precision of structural design. He knew I did not make reckless moves fueled by raw emotion. "No," he admitted slowly. "You have not." "Then trust my architecture," I replied. "Take Emily to the wedding. Make sure you wear a very nice suit. And whatever you do when Jason steps up to the microphone to give his groom's speech, make sure you have your phone out and recording. You are going to want to capture the exact look on Barbara's face when the grand finale hits." "What exactly are you bringing to this wedding, Lauren?" he asked, a hint of nervous anticipation creeping into his voice. "I am bringing a mirror," I said softly. "I am going to show them exactly what they are, and I am going to let them watch their entire fraudulent empire burn to the ground. I will see you on Saturday, Jamal." I ended the call before he could ask any more questions. The pieces of the board were now perfectly aligned. Jason thought he was dragging a defenseless victim into a public arena for a final execution of my dignity. He had zero comprehension that I had already locked the doors, soaked the floor in gasoline, and was walking in holding the only match. I grabbed my designer coat and locked my office door, leaving the corporate world behind for the weekend. The drive back to my penthouse was swift. The moment I stepped out of my private elevator, the sound of three chaotic, energetic 5-year-olds filled the hallway. My nanny was attempting to gather small shoes and jackets, but Leo, Mason, and Riley were practically vibrating with excitement. "Are we going on the airplane now?" Mason shouted, running toward me with a toy dinosaur clutched in his fist. "Almost my sweet boy," I said, scooping him up into my arms and kissing his cheek. I checked the pristine garment bags hanging by the front door. Inside were the bespoke, custom-tailored suits for my sons and a breathtaking silk dress for Riley. They would not be wearing cheap hand-me-downs to this event. They were stepping into that country club looking exactly like the heirs to my Vanguard empire. My phone buzzed again. The driver was outside. The long journey from my penthouse to the private tarmac was a blur of seamless logistics. I did not bother with commercial airlines or crowded terminals. When you are the chief executive officer of a data auditing firm handling multi-million-dollar corporate mergers, you control your own environment. A chartered jet waited for us. The flight was incredibly smooth. I leaned back in my seat, enjoying the quiet hum of the engines. Leo, Mason, and Riley treated the plush interior like their personal playground. They watched cartoons while I reviewed the encrypted flash drive. Every footprint of Jason's stealing was meticulously catalogued. We landed in Southern California under a canopy of cloudless skies. The salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean filtered through the air as we stepped off the tarmac. Waiting for us on the runway was not a standard rental car. I had arranged for a black armored luxury sport utility vehicle. It was designed for high-profile executives requiring absolute security. The tinted windows were impenetrable, turning the massive vehicle into a rolling fortress. The transition to the car was completely flawless, a testament to proper planning. My security driver held the heavy door open as I guided the triplets into the spacious seats. The drive down the coast toward the Pelican Hill Resort was stunning, but my mind was focused on tactical execution. I adjusted the collar of Leo's bespoke tuxedo. The midnight black material contrasted perfectly with his bright blue eyes, eyes that were a chilling replica of Jason's. I smoothed down Mason's matching jacket. Then I turned to Riley. She wore a handcrafted navy silk dress perfectly matching my evening gown. Her dark curls framed a face carrying my determination and her biological father's arrogant smirk. "Are you ready for your special mission today?" I asked Riley, pulling the manila envelope from my leather handbag. She gently patted her lap where she had carefully placed her small hands, just as I taught her. "I am ready, Mommy. I remember my lines." I hand the envelope to the man in the suit. "You are going to do beautifully," I said, handing her the heavy envelope stamped with the red legal seal of the family court. The $1.8 million child support summons was now officially in play. The armored vehicle turned off the coastal highway and approached the resort. Jason and Courtney spared no expense, or rather spared none of Courtney's father's embezzled money. The driveway was flanked by towering floral arrangements of imported white roses. The sheer volume must have cost upwards of $80,000. A string quartet played classical music near the valet station. The circular driveway was clogged with brightly colored sports cars belonging to the elite guests. Our massive blacked-out vehicle rolled up the pristine driveway, an imposing shadow gliding through a sea of ostentatious wealth. The contrast was deliberate. They wanted to project flashy, newly acquired status. They believed they were the most important people in the state today. I was bringing the silent, crushing weight of undeniable power. As my driver pulled up to the front doors, the team of valets immediately stopped what they were doing. They were accustomed to handling luxury cars, but an armored executive transport signaled a completely different level of authority. The head valet rushed forward, his posture rigid and professional. My driver stepped out first, his dark suit and earpiece instantly changing the atmosphere around the entrance. He walked around the rear of the vehicle and pulled open the heavy reinforced passenger door. I stepped out gracefully into the warm, bright California sun. My midnight blue gown cascaded down my silhouette, the fabric catching the light with a subtle, expensive shimmer. It was not a dress purchased from a charity bin, nor was it a desperate attempt to fit in. It was a piece of wearable architecture designed to command the space the moment I occupied it. I paired it with a simple diamond necklace and my signature icy composure. Several guests lingering near the entrance paused their conversations. I could feel their eyes sweeping over me, trying to place my face, wondering which tech billionaire or industry mogul I was married to. They had no idea I was the punchline to Jason and Barbara's cruel inside joke. I was the barren, discarded starter wife they had invited just to mock. But I was definitely not standing alone. I turned back to the vehicle and extended my hands. Leo stepped down first, looking like a miniature corporate titan in his tailored tuxedo. Mason followed, his dark hair slicked back, his expression serious. Finally, my driver helped Riley step down onto the pavement. She clutched the manila envelope tightly against her silk dress, her chin raised with an innate sense of confidence that she certainly did not inherit from Jason's side of the family. The three of them stood beside me, an undeniable living testament to the 5 years of lies Jason had constructed. Anyone with a pair of functioning eyes who had ever met the groom would instantly recognize his genetic blueprint stamped across the faces of my 2 sons. We walked forward together. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished stone of the resort walkway. The valets scrambled to clear a path. The string quartet's music seemed to fade into the background as we approached the grand double doors of the main lobby. I did not look nervously around. I did not check my phone. I kept my gaze fixed dead ahead, moving with the terrifying grace of an apex predator stepping into a cage full of oblivious prey. Jason wanted to show me what a real functioning family looked like. I was about to show him exactly what a reckoning felt like. We reached the massive glass doors of the venue, and I placed my hand firmly on the thick brass handle. The luxurious cocktail hour awaited us just beyond the grand threshold. I pushed the heavy brass doors open and stepped into the sprawling lobby of the resort. The air conditioning was crisp, carrying the scent of expensive floral arrangements and ocean salt. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors. Guests in tuxedos and designer gowns milled about, holding champagne flutes and laughing softly. I kept my children close to my side, moving with absolute purpose toward the grand ballroom where the cocktail hour was being held. Before I could cross the lobby, a man in a sharp black suit stepped directly into my path. He had an earpiece curled around his right ear and a clipboard in his left hand. An event manager flanked by 2 burly security guards hurried up right behind him. They looked completely stressed, their eyes darting from my face to the children and then down to their clipboards with deep concern. "Excuse me, madam," the man with the earpiece said, holding up a hand to stop me. "I am going to need to see your invitation. This is a private closed event for the Apex Tech Chief Executive Officer and his family." I met his gaze without blinking. "I am on the guest list," I replied smoothly. "The name is Lauren." The event manager flipped frantically through her pages. She paused, her finger tracing a line of text, and then her face flushed red. "Oh, I see it here. Lauren." She looked up, her expression a mix of pity and discomfort. "However, we have strict instructions regarding your arrival. The bride specifically requested that you be escorted through the rear service entrance. She also noted that you would be arriving alone. We cannot allow children into the main reception area, especially uninvited ones." I let out a soft, amused breath. Courtney really had thought of absolutely everything to ensure my total humiliation. She wanted me paraded through the back doors like hired help, hidden from the wealthy guests, until she was ready to display me as a prop in her fairy tale. She wanted to strip away my dignity before I even saw the groom. "I am not using the service entrance," I stated, my voice dropping to a calm, authoritative register that I use during hostile corporate takeovers. "And my children are staying right by my side. Now step aside." The security guards shifted their weight, crossing their arms to form a physical barricade. "Madam," the head guard warned, his tone dropping an octave. "We do not want to cause a scene. The bride father is paying a fortune for total security today. We have orders to remove anyone who causes a disruption." If you do not comply with the entry protocols, I will have to ask you to leave the property immediately. I was just about to reach into my designer bag to pull out my VIP resort credentials, which my firm had secured during the audit setup, when a familiar deep voice echoed across the marble floor. "Stand down. She is with me." I turned to see Jamal striding across the lobby. He looked incredibly sharp in a tailored charcoal suit that complemented his tall, athletic frame. As an African-American architect who navigated elite, pretentious circles daily, Jamal commanded respect effortlessly. He walked right up to the security barrier, his presence instantly altering the dynamic of the standoff. "Mr. Jamal." The event manager stammered, recognizing him immediately as the groom brother-in-law. "The bride gave us very specific instructions about this guest. And I am giving you new instructions." Jamal countered, his voice smooth, but holding an edge of absolute authority. "She is family. She is on the guest list, and she is walking through those front doors with me. If Courtney has a problem with it, you can tell her to come out here and interrupt her own photo session to argue with me. Otherwise, back away." The security guards exchanged a hesitant glance. Jamal belonged to the inner family circle. Disrespecting him could cost them their jobs just as easily as defying Courtney. Slowly, the head guard nodded and stepped aside, signaling for the others to lower their arms. The event manager swallowed hard and stepped back, clearing our path to the grand ballroom. "Thank you, Jamal," I said, adjusting the strap of my leather handbag. He let out a low, impressed whistle, slowly shaking his head. "I told you they were sharpening their knives, Lauren. They literally put a bounty on your dignity at the front door." He looked at my gown, his eyebrows raising in appreciation. "Though I have to admit, you do not look like a woman who came here to be humiliated. You look like you came to buy the whole resort." Before I could respond, Jamal glanced down. For the first time, he noticed the 3 tiny figures standing perfectly still beside my dress. His eyes went wide. He looked at Riley holding her thick manila envelope. He looked at Mason, who was staring back at him with quiet intensity. Then his gaze locked onto Leo. Leo, with his sharp jawline and bright blue eyes, was an exact, undeniable carbon copy of Jason. Jamal froze. The breath completely left his lungs. He stared at the boys, then looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing as the mathematical reality of the last 5 years hit him like a freight train. He did the math. 5 years since the divorce, 3 5-year-old children. "Oh my goodness," Jamal whispered, his voice cracking. He took a step back, dragging a hand over his face. "Lauren, tell me now, are these kids actually his?" I smiled gently and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jamal, I would like you to meet Leo, Mason, and Riley. Kids, this is Uncle Jamal." Jamal stared at the miniature versions of the groom. He looked from my calm, calculating expression down to the envelope, and he understood absolutely everything. Jamal let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head as a massive grin spread across his face. He muttered under his breath that Jason was completely and utterly doomed. He offered me his arm, telling me it was time to make an entrance they would never forget. We walked through the grand archways and into the Pelican Hill main ballroom. The sheer opulence of the cocktail hour was staggering. Crystal champagne towers gleamed under the custom lighting. Waiters in pristine white jackets carried silver trays loaded with caviar and truffle appetizers. The elite guests of Silicon Valley mingled under cascading floral installations that hung from the vaulted ceilings. I kept my posture absolutely rigid, knowing exactly how every single flower petal and drop of expensive champagne had been funded. My children walked perfectly in step beside me, unfazed by the crowd. It only took 3 minutes for the familial radar to go off. Across the room, near a massive ice sculpture that likely cost more than a luxury vehicle, Barbara and Richard were holding court. They were surrounded by a group of older corporate executives, laughing loudly and playing the role of the perfect high society parents. I watched Barbara as her gaze lazily swept the crowd and suddenly froze. She locked eyes with me. I could literally see the immediate sneer forming on her carefully treated lips. She tapped Richard forcefully on the shoulder and whispered something frantic in his ear. They excused themselves from their audience and marched toward me. Their body language was aggressive, clearly intending to intercept me before I could mingle with any of the important tech guests. Barbara approached with a face that was a mask of polite societal horror. It was the exact kind of expression reserved for seeing a pest scurry across the floor of a fine dining establishment. Lauren, Barbara hissed, keeping her voice low and venomous so the surrounding guests would not overhear. I absolutely cannot believe you actually showed up here and trying to bypass the service entrance. Have you no shame at all? Richard stood slightly behind her, puffing out his chest to look imposing. You are completely out of your depth here, Lauren, he added, his tone dripping with patronizing authority. We offered you a cheap motel room to be polite, not as an open invitation to parade around our new family causing a scene. You need to leave before Courtney sees you. Barbara continued her verbal assault, raking her eyes up and down my body. She clearly expected to see me trembling in a bargain rack dress. Her eyes narrowed defensively as she registered the impeccable cut and midnight blue silk of my designer gown. She immediately pivoted her attack strategy, attempting her classic manipulation routine. Did you rent that? She asked mockingly, letting out a sharp, cruel laugh. Did you max out your very last credit card just to pretend you belong in this world? It is incredibly pathetic, Lauren. You are trying to compete with a billionaire daughter and you just look desperate. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I calmly reached out and took a crystal flute from a passing waiter, taking a slow sip of the stolen champagne. I bought it outright, Barbara, I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. Just like I bought the silence you have been enjoying for the last 5 years. But unfortunately for you, that silence expires today. Barbara rolled her eyes, completely missing the threat embedded in my words. You always were overly dramatic, she scoffed. You are just bitter because Jason moved on to a woman who can actually give him a family and a legacy. Speaking of which, you need to step out of the main hall right now. Your presence is an embarrassment to my son. It was at that exact moment that Barbara finally glanced down. She noticed the 3 small children standing quietly and obediently beside my skirt. Her lips curled into a nasty, victorious smile. She thought she had found the ultimate ammunition to break my spirit. Do not tell me you adopted a bunch of strays just to pretend you finally got over your barren womb, Barbara sneered, pointing a manicured finger at my kids. You dragged some random orphans to my son's wedding to play house and make him jealous. You really are mentally unwell, Lauren. You need psychiatric help, not a wedding cake. Richard chuckled darkly, shaking his head. Bringing fake kids to your ex-husband wedding is a new low even for you. I smiled warmly at Riley, gently stroking her dark curls. I did not adopt them, Barbara, I said softly. I gave birth to them. Exactly 4.5 years ago. Barbara scoffed again, waving her hand dismissively. Please. We all know you are completely sterile. Jason told us everything about your medical failures. You cannot just invent a pregnancy to make yourself feel better. I leaned in slightly, closing the distance between us so she could hear every single syllable clearly. I was never sterile, Barbara. I was pregnant the exact day your son handed me divorce papers and ran off to chase a trust fund. I just decided not to tell him. Barbara froze. Her cruel smile vanished instantly. She slowly lowered her gaze back down to the 3 children. This time she actually looked at them. She looked at Riley, confident smirk. She looked at Mason, unruly brown hair. Then her eyes locked dead onto Leo. Leo stared back at her with bright blue eyes and a jawline that was a flawless, undeniable replica of the man she had given birth to 35 years ago. The air completely left Barbara's lungs. She grabbed Richard's arm. He slowly looked down, his mouth opening in silent shock. They are actually his, Barbara whispered, trembling with sudden panic. Yes, I replied calmly, sipping my expensive stolen champagne. They are here to collect. Barbara stumbled backward as if I had physically struck her. Her manicured hands flew to her chest, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. She stared at the 3 children standing around my skirt, her eyes darting frantically between their faces. The undeniable genetic truth was carving a canyon through her carefully constructed reality. Richard stepped up beside his wife, his face draining of all color. He looked down at Leo. Leo tilted his head, his bright blue eyes locking onto his grandfather, with a look of mild curiosity. It was the exact same piercing stare Jason used when he was trying to intimidate a subordinate. Then Richard looked at Mason. Mason had his arms crossed over his chest, tapping his polished leather shoe against the marble floor, a gesture so distinctly identical to Jason's impatient habit that it made Richard physically flinch. "The math is quite simple, Richard," I said, maintaining a conversational volume. "5 years ago, your son handed me a stack of legal documents and told me my empty womb was a burden he could no longer carry. He ran off to secure his position in high society. I walked into an obstetrics clinic and discovered I was carrying 3 of his heirs. I raised them entirely without his help, without your help, and without a single dime of his money." "You are lying," Barbara hissed, her voice vibrating with raw panic. "This is a trick. You went to a sperm bank. You used a donor. You are just trying to ruin my son on the most important day of his life." I raised an eyebrow, letting a cold smile play across my lips. A donor who miraculously replicated Jason's exact jaw structure, his hair growth pattern, and his precise eye color. "That is quite the medical marvel, Barbara. You can deny it all you want, but DNA does not care about your delusions." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his tight collar. He glanced nervously over his shoulder toward the center of the ballroom. Standing near the grand staircase was Courtney, draped in a custom white gown, laughing with her billionaire father, the chief executive officer of Apex Tech. Richard knew exactly what was at stake. If the chief executive officer found out that his future son-in-law had 3 secret 5-year-old children hidden away from a previous marriage, the wedding would be canceled instantly. The corporate merger would collapse. The wealth and status Richard and Barbara had been salivating over would vanish into thin air. "Lauren, please," Richard said, his voice dropping to a desperate begging whisper. "You cannot do this right now. You cannot introduce them today. Courtney has no idea. Her father has no idea. This will destroy everything Jason has worked for." I took another slow sip of my champagne. "That is the entire point, Richard." Barbara lunged forward, grabbing my forearm with a grip fueled by absolute terror. I did not flinch, but I looked pointedly at her hand until she released me, as if she had been burned. "Name your price," Barbara demanded, her chest heaving. She reached into her expensive clutch and pulled out a designer checkbook. "I will write you a check right now. 50,000, 100,000. Whatever you need to pack these kids back into whatever car you came in and drive away. Just leave. Go back to your sad little apartment. We will set up a quiet legal meeting next week to handle the custody and the finances secretly. Just leave this resort." I looked at the checkbook trembling in her hand and let out a genuine musical laugh. The sheer arrogance of her assumption was almost entertaining. She still thought I was the struggling, desperate woman Jason had discarded. She had absolutely no comprehension of the financial titans standing in front of her. "Put your worthless checkbook away, Barbara," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You do not have enough zeros in your entire bank account to buy my compliance. I do not want your money. I am here for justice, and justice is significantly more expensive than $100,000. Jamal stepped forward, placing himself slightly between me and my ex-in-laws. His presence as an African-American man of towering height and impeccable style was deeply intimidating to Richard. Jamal looked down at the older couple, shaking his head with quiet disgust. "You two really have not figured it out yet, have you?" Jamal asked, his voice smooth and commanding. "You are standing here trying to bribe a woman who just pulled up to this venue in a customized armored vehicle. You are treating her like a beggar while she is wearing a dress that costs more than your entire wedding catering budget. I tried to warn you both that your arrogance was going to backfire, but you refused to listen." Barbara ignored Jamal, her eyes fixed solely on me in absolute terror. "Lauren, I am begging you as a mother, do not destroy my son. You destroyed yourselves," I replied coldly. "You mocked me for years. You enabled a man who abandoned his responsibilities to chase a trust fund. You invited me here today specifically to humiliate me in front of your wealthy new friends. You assigned me a seat next to the kitchen doors so I could watch my ex-husband play family man with another woman. I am simply delivering the reality you asked for." Before Barbara could launch another desperate plea, the loud chime of a crystal glass being tapped echoed through the ballroom. The event manager stepped up to a microphone near the grand staircase. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event manager announced, her voice projecting clearly over the sound system. "If you would please make your way to the dining tables, the bride and groom will be making their grand entrance shortly." The crowd began to shift, a sea of elegant gowns and sharp tuxedos flowing toward the assigned seating areas. Barbara and Richard looked completely trapped. They could not physically force me out of the room without causing a massive public spectacle, and they could not hide the existence of 3 miniature versions of Jason walking through the venue. Barbara tried one last frantic tactic. She stepped sideways, attempting to use her body and the width of her expensive gown to physically block the children from the view of the passing guests. It was a pathetic, comical display of denial. She was literally trying to sweep 3 human beings under a rug. "Let us go find our table, kids," I said smoothly, ignoring Barbara's frantic shuffling. "We have a very special seat waiting for us." I took Riley's hand while Leo and Mason walked proudly on my other side. Jamal offered me a respectful nod and escorted us right past my hyperventilating ex-in-laws. They stood frozen near the ice sculpture, their faces pale and slick with nervous sweat, watching their entire fraudulent legacy march directly toward the center of the reception hall. We moved through the crowd, heading toward the back corridors where they had purposely tried to hide me. They thought Table 14 was an insult. They were about to realize it was the perfect staging ground for absolute destruction. We moved past the lavish centerpieces, leaving the glowing crystal chandeliers behind as we approached the far edge of the ballroom. The transition was sharp and deliberately insulting. The plush carpeting gave way to scuffed hardwood, and the ambient acoustics were quickly replaced by the chaotic clattering of silverware. Table 14 was quite literally positioned inside the service corridor annex. It was squeezed between a stack of spare banquet chairs and the heavy swinging wooden doors leading directly into the main kitchen. A young waiter holding a stack of dirty bus tubs nearly collided with us. He froze, his eyes widening as he took in my designer gown and the 3 impeccably dressed children standing by my side. He looked at the seating chart taped to the wall, then back at me in total bewilderment. He clearly knew this table was intended as a punishment, a dark corner meant to hide an unwanted guest. Yet I did not shrink or display a single ounce of embarrassment. I smiled at him, projecting the effortless authority of a woman who owned the building. "Good evening," I said, my voice carrying a warm, commanding resonance. "We are seated at table 14. Could you please bring my children some sparkling water and extra napkins?" The waiter stood up straighter, nodding quickly. "Right away, ma'am. I apologize for the draft here. Let me move these trays out of your way." I guided Leo, Mason, and Riley to their seats. They sat down with the perfect posture of miniature executives preparing for a board meeting. Riley placed her sealed manila envelope squarely in the center of her porcelain dinner plate, guarding it with absolute focus. Leo surveyed the frantic waitstaff rushing past our table, his blue eyes sharp and observant. Mason adjusted his bow tie and patiently folded his hands in his lap. They were perfectly disciplined, absolutely unfazed by the chaotic kitchen noises echoing behind us. I sat facing the grand ballroom. From this shadowy vantage point, I had an unobstructed view of the entire reception area, including the elevated head table draped in white silk. It was the perfect strategic overlook. I watched Barbara and Richard take their seats near the front. They were sweating, their movements jerky and paranoid. They kept throwing terrified glances over their shoulders toward the dark annex, desperately trying to see if I was making a move. I simply raised my glass in the shadows, letting them sweat. A sudden commotion near the VIP section caught my attention. Jamal was standing up from table 2, a highly visible spot reserved for the groom's immediate family. He was a towering, athletic figure in his charcoal suit, and he was completely ignoring his wife Emily's frantic whispers to sit down. Jamal bypassed the standard buffet line entirely. Instead, he walked directly over to the premium carving station intended exclusively for the bridal party. He picked up 2 massive silver platters and began loading them with the most expensive catering items available in the room. He stacked butter-poached lobster tails, thick cuts of prime Wagyu beef, and generous portions of truffle risotto. The catering manager tried to intervene, but Jamal simply flashed a brilliant, disarming smile, said something quietly that made the manager step back, and turned toward our dark corner. Jamal strode across the ballroom carrying the extravagant feast right past the glaring eyes of his mother-in-law. Barbara looked like she was about to have a stroke right there in her designer chair. Jamal ignored her completely. He pushed through the service corridor and set the heavy silver platters down on our cramped table right next to the kitchen doors. "Nobody in my family is eating standard banquet food tonight," Jamal announced, his rich voice echoing slightly in the corridor. "Especially not my favorite niece and nephews." Leo and Mason looked at the massive lobster tails with wide eyes. Riley grinned up at him. "Thank you, Uncle Jamal," she chirped. "You are very welcome, little boss." Jamal laughed, pulling out a spare chair and sitting down right next to us. He completely abandoned his VIP seat at the front of the room to join the discarded ex-wife in the kitchen annex. It was a massive public display of solidarity, and it drove a stake right through Barbara's obsession with social optics. Guests at the nearby tables were already whispering, wondering why the groom's imposing African-American brother-in-law had chosen to dine in the service hallway. "You are going to give Barbara a heart attack before I even deliver my gift," I noted, elegantly slicing a piece of Wagyu beef for Riley. Jamal leaned back, crossing his arms and grinning. "That woman has been terrorizing my wife and micromanaging my life for 2 years. Watching her panic tonight is the best meal I have ever had. She just spent 10 minutes frantically whispering to Richard that you somehow cloned Jason in a laboratory. She is entirely unhinged." "Let her spin her delusions," I replied, taking a bite of the exquisite steak. "It will make the reality check that much more devastating." Our corner of the room suddenly became the most well-attended table in the venue. The waitstaff, taking a clear cue from Jamal's rebellion and my confident demeanor, began treating table 14 like the true VIP section. The young waiter from earlier returned with a bucket of premium iced sparkling water, ignoring the other tables to ensure my children had everything they needed. Another server slipped us a tray of gourmet chocolate desserts before they were even offered to the main room. We dined like royalty in the shadows of the service annex. The opulent ballroom slowly began to darken. The ambient lighting dimmed, shifting to a dramatic spotlight focused squarely on the grand staircase. The string quartet stopped playing, replaced by a loud, upbeat pop song pumping through the massive overhead speakers. The event coordinator's voice boomed across the reception hall, demanding the crowd's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice echoed, vibrating against the hardwood floors. "Please take your seats and direct your attention to the grand staircase. It is my absolute honor to introduce to you for the very first time as husband and wife Jason and Courtney." The entire ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. The elite tech executives, the wealthy socialites, and Jason's enabling family all rose to their feet, cheering wildly. The spotlight hit the top of the stairs. I set down my fork and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. I turned to Riley, who was already sitting up perfectly straight, her small hands resting firmly on the manila envelope. "Are you ready, my clever girl?" I asked quietly, my voice slicing clearly through the roar of the crowd. Riley looked at the spotlight, then back at me. "I am ready, Mommy. I know exactly what to do." "Good," I whispered. "Watch the stairs." I reached over and gently adjusted the silk collar of Riley's navy dress, ensuring she looked utterly flawless. Beside her, Leo and Mason mirrored my absolute stillness, their bright blue eyes reflecting the flashing lights of the ballroom. Jamal sat back in his chair, pulling his smartphone from his tailored jacket pocket. He tapped the screen, loading his camera application, his thumb hovering over the red record button. The deafening cheers from the wealthy crowd swelled to a crescendo as the music volume spiked higher. The heavy velvet curtains at the top of the marble staircase slowly pulled apart, preparing to reveal the deceitful groom to his adoring audience. The true execution was finally beginning. Jason stepped through the velvet curtains, raising his arms like a conquering gladiator. He wore a custom white tuxedo jacket with black lapels, an outfit clearly chosen to command absolute attention. Courtney clung to his arm, radiating the blissful ignorance of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. Her diamond tiara caught the chandelier light, shooting fractured beams across the ceiling. They descended the marble steps to thunderous applause. Jason scanned the room, soaking in the validation of the elite, completely unaware that his financial executioner was seated just 50 feet away. I watched his body language closely. He stood unnaturally tall, puffing out his chest whenever Courtney Father, the chief executive officer of Apex Tech, looked in his direction. Jason was playing the role of the visionary corporate leader, a man who had earned his place among the wealthy. He waved to his colleagues, flashing his blinding, artificially whitened smile. He did not look toward the service doors. He did not look toward table 14. In his mind, I was already relegated to the invisible margins of his triumphant narrative. Jamal leaned closer to me, his phone steadily recording the spectacle. "Look at him," Jamal whispered. "He actually believes he belongs here. He thinks he outsmarted everyone." I nodded, picking up my glass of sparkling water. "Let him enjoy the applause," I replied quietly. "The higher the pedestal, the more devastating the drop." The newlyweds finished their grand entrance and moved directly to the center of the dance floor. An event manager handed Jason a sleek silver microphone. The music faded out, leaving only the hum of the expectant crowd. Jason tapped the microphone twice, the sharp sounds echoing through the massive hall. The room fell entirely silent. "Thank you, Jason," began, his voice oozing with practiced charisma. "Thank you all for being here to witness the greatest day of my life." He turned to Courtney, kissing her hand with theatrical devotion. "Courtney, you are my everything. You saved me. And to my incredible new father-in-law, thank you for welcoming me into your empire. I promise to protect your daughter and your legacy with everything I have." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Protect the legacy. He was currently draining that very legacy through an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. Jason paced across the dance floor, addressing the crowd with the cadence of a motivational speaker. "Finding true happiness is rarely a straight line." He continued, his tone turning dramatically somber. "Sometimes you have to walk through a barren desert before you find an oasis. Many of you know that my path here was not easy. I spent years anchored to a life that was going absolutely nowhere. I was trapped in a sterile, lifeless situation, carrying the dead weight of a past that simply could not grow." Across the room, I saw Barbara practically slide down in her chair. Richard wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead. They knew exactly what Jason was doing. He was using his wedding speech to publicly humiliate me, completely oblivious to the fact that I was sitting in the room, surrounded by the 3 children he claimed I could never produce. Barbara tried to catch his eye, shaking her head frantically, but Jason was too intoxicated by his own arrogance to notice his mother sinking into a state of silent panic. "I wanted to build an empire," Jason projected, his voice rising with theatrical emotion. "I wanted a legacy. I wanted a real family. But my past was empty. It was a barren, fruitless chapter that drained my energy and offered absolutely no return on investment. I realized I had to cut my losses. I had to leave the dead branches behind to find a tree that could actually bear fruit. And then I found Courtney. She gave me the family I was always meant to have. She gave me life." Courtney wiped a single delicate tear from her cheek, pressing her head against Jason's shoulder. The crowd let out a collective, sympathetic sigh. The billionaire chief executive officer nodded approvingly, raising his champagne flute to his fraudulent son-in-law. They were all entirely captivated by the tragic tale of the ambitious man escaping his defective, useless starter wife. I felt Leo shift in his chair next to me. Mason narrowed his eyes at the man on the stage. Riley simply gripped her manila envelope tighter, her small knuckles turning white. They did not understand the cruel metaphors, but they understood the hostile tone. They felt the shift in the atmosphere. "Tonight is not just about a wedding," Jason declared, raising his own glass toward the ceiling. "Tonight is about leaving the worthless things behind. Tonight is about stepping into power, about recognizing true value, and about knowing that I finally have everything I deserve. Here is to a future free of dead weight." Here's to my beautiful bride. The ballroom erupted in thunderous cheers, glasses clinked, people whistled. Jason stood in the center of it all, basking in the validation he had stolen. He handed the microphone back to the event manager, smiling as the audience continued to applaud his ruthless, self-serving narrative. Jamal lowered his phone slightly, turning his gaze toward me. That was a masterpiece of absolute delusion, Jamal whispered. I cannot believe he just said those things. I gently rested my hand on Riley's shoulder. Let him dig the hole as deep as he wants, I replied calmly. It only makes the burial more efficient. The event manager stepped right back up to the grand podium, adjusting the heavy microphone stand. We would now like to open the floor for any guests who wish to offer blessings to the happy couple, she announced. I looked down at my brilliant, beautiful 5-year-old daughter. It was now officially time. The event manager stepped back, leaving the sleek silver microphone on its weighted stand in the dead center of the polished marble dance floor. The first person to step up was a man in a velvet tuxedo, a former college fraternity brother of Jason, who now ran a mid-tier software startup. He slurred his words, slightly fueled by the open bar of premium liquor, making a tasteless, thinly veiled joke about how Jason finally traded up for a premium model after years of driving a rental. The crowd chuckled politely. I watched Jason slap his friend on the back, reveling in the toxic validation. Beside him, Courtney blushed perfectly, playing the role of the adoring prize. It was entirely nauseating, but it served as the perfect psychological build-up. Jamal scoffed quietly next to me, shaking his head. These people are insufferable, he muttered, keeping his phone securely propped against his water glass to maintain a steady recording angle. They literally measure human worth by stock portfolios and designer labels. They have absolutely no idea what is sitting in the dark right next to them. Next came the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Tech. The room fell into absolute reverent silence the moment he approached the microphone. He spoke with the low, measured cadence of a man who controls markets and ruins lives before breakfast. He talked about legacy. He talked about finding a successor who understands the value of ruthless ambition and unwavering loyalty. Jason the billionaire said, raising a glass of incredibly rare vintage champagne, "You prove to me that you understand what it means to cut away the dead wood to protect the core tree. You are the son I never had, and I am handing you the keys to the kingdom." The irony was so thick it practically suffocated the room. I glanced down at my leather handbag, knowing the encrypted flash drive inside contained the exact digital coordinates of Jason stealing over $4 million from the very man currently toasting his integrity. The billionaire was essentially handing the keys to a man who had already picked the locks and robbed the vault. I shifted my gaze from the brightly lit stage back to the VIP tables near the front. Barbara had not touched her food. Her prime Wagyu beef sat cold and untouched on her porcelain plate. She was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were bone white. Richard was whispering furiously into her ear, his face slick with nervous sweat, but she simply shook her head. Her eyes were wide, terrified, and fixed firmly on the service annex where we sat. She knew the executioner was in the room. She could see my children sitting quietly in the shadows. Every time a new guest walked toward the microphone, Barbara physically flinched, absolutely terrified that I would be the one stepping into the light to destroy her son. But I had absolutely no intention of making a scene myself. Why would I lower myself to arguing with a man I had mathematically and legally defeated? I leaned down until I was exactly eye level with Riley. Her dark curls brushed against my cheek, and the scent of her strawberry shampoo briefly cut through the overwhelming aroma of the extravagant floral centerpieces. I smoothed the collar of her navy silk dress and looked directly into her bright, intelligent eyes. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" I asked softly, making sure my tone was encouraging and completely devoid of my own internal rage. Riley nodded firmly, her little hands gripping the thick manila envelope. The red legal seal of the family court stood out starkly against her dark dress. "I remember my lines, Mommy," she whispered back, her voice steady and confident. I walk up to the man in the white jacket. I hand him the paper. I tell him he forgot our birthday and he owes us money. I smiled, a genuine expression of intense maternal pride, mixed with cold, calculated strategy. Exactly, I said gently, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. You walk straight up to him. You speak very clearly into the tall microphone so everyone can hear you. You do not let anyone interrupt you. If anyone tries to take the envelope before you reach him, you hold on tight and keep walking. Can you be my brave girl today? Riley squared her tiny shoulders. She possessed a fearless, dominant spirit that constantly amazed me. I am brave, she confirmed. Leo and Mason sat perfectly still beside us, watching the exchange with serious expressions. They did not fully grasp the legal magnitude of the envelope, but they understood the mission. They knew we were here to deliver an important message to a man who had not been very nice to their mother. Mason reached over and patted Riley on the arm, a silent gesture of solidarity. On the stage, the billionaire finished his speech to a roaring, standing ovation. Jason looked like he had conquered the entire world. He raised his glass to his new father-in-law, his chest puffed out with arrogant triumph. The event manager took the microphone back, her eyes scanning the vast sea of high society guests. Do we have any final blessings for the bride and groom before we open the dance floor? She asked, her voice echoing through the massive overhead speakers. Jamal shifted in his seat next to me. He adjusted his grip on his smartphone, ensuring the camera lens had a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of the stage, the groom and the terrified mother of the groom. The red recording light blinked steadily in the dim annex. I stood up slowly, ensuring my silhouette was visible to the VIP tables. I saw Barbara gasp, clapping a hand over her mouth. She thought I was coming for the microphone. Instead, I placed my hand gently on Riley's back. Go get him, I whispered. Riley stepped forward. She did not hesitate for a single second. My 5-year-old daughter walked out from the shadows of the service annex and straight into the brilliant illumination of the grand ballroom. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace, her navy silk dress brushing lightly against her knees. She clutched the thick manila envelope against her chest with both hands. The red legal seal faced outward, a glaring warning label, moving through a sea of oblivious luxury. Guests sitting at the perimeter tables were the first to notice her. Conversations abruptly paused. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to their mouths. A tiny, unaccompanied child marching toward the main stage at a high-fashion black tie event was a stark anomaly. The crowd instinctively parted for her. Men in expensive custom tuxedos stepped back. Women in designer gowns pulled their flowing skirts aside. They watched her with amused curiosity, assuming she was a lost flower girl or a niece preparing to deliver a cute scripted blessing. They had no idea she was a highly trained tactical missile. I remained standing proudly at table 14, my arms crossed, watching my daughter execute the plan flawlessly. Jamal shifted beside me, ensuring his smartphone camera captured a wide angle of the entire interaction. At the VIP table, Barbara let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She tried to stand up, her hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth so tightly the crystal glasses rattled, but Richard yanked her back down by her wrist. He knew that causing a physical scene now would only draw more attention. They were completely paralyzed by their own obsession with social decorum. Riley reached the edge of the polished marble dance floor. She looked up at the grand staircase where Jason and Courtney stood. Jason had a condescending, charming smile plastered across his face. He leaned down toward the event manager, likely asking whose child had wandered onto the floor. Then his eyes locked onto Riley. I watched from the shadows as the blood drained entirely from my ex-husband's face. The charming smile completely collapsed. His confident posture crumpled. He was staring down at a miniature female version of himself. He saw his own distinct jawline, his own arrogant smirk, and the piercing stare that perfectly mirrored his own reflection. The biological reality hit him with the force of a physical blow. Next to him, Courtney looked confused, tilting her head and smiling politely at the little girl holding the large envelope. The event manager, assuming this was an unplanned but adorable family surprise, quickly lowered the heavy microphone stand so it was exactly at Riley height. The entire ballroom fell into a pin-drop silence. Hundreds of elite guests held their breath, waiting for a sweet, heartwarming message. Riley leaned forward, her mouth just inches from the sleek silver microphone. Her voice rang out crystal clear, echoing through the massive overhead speakers and filling every corner of the extravagant venue. "Are you Jason?" she asked. The question sliced through the silence. It was not a cheerful greeting. It was a formal interrogation. Jason stood completely frozen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man standing on the tracks watching a massive freight train approach. Riley did not wait for his answer. She stood perfectly straight and continued delivering her lines with flawless, undeniable confidence. "Mommy said you forgot our 5th birthday," Riley announced loudly. Her voice carried the innocent, factual tone of a child pointing out a simple truth. But to the hundreds of guests listening, the words hit like a physical shockwave. A collective audible gasp rippled across the grand ballroom. Courtney's polite smile instantly vanished. She whipped her head around to stare at Jason, her eyes wide with sudden panic and profound confusion. Jason took a stumbling step backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the slick marble floor. He raised his hands in a defensive gesture, shaking his head frantically, but he remained completely mute. Riley stepped closer to the microphone. "The lawyer man told me to give you this," she declared, her voice projecting with absolute authority. She held up the thick manila envelope, the bright red legal seal glowing under the harsh stage lights. "He said you owe us $1.8 million for child support. Here are your papers." The silence that followed those specific words was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the distinct sound of a carefully constructed fraudulent empire completely imploding in real time. $1.8 million. Child support. The phrases echoed in the minds of every billionaire technology executive and wealthy socialite in the room. Riley stepped away from the microphone. She marched directly up the first 2 marble steps, closing the distance between herself and the terrified groom. She shoved the heavy manila envelope directly into Jason's trembling hands. He took it instinctively, his fingers curling around the thick legal documents like he was holding an active explosive device. Riley did not linger. She turned her small back on him, immediately displaying a level of cold indifference that I had spent the last 5 years perfecting. She walked back down the marble steps, her dark curls bouncing with every confident stride. She marched across the dance floor, parting the sea of horrified guests a second time. She headed straight back toward the dark shadows of the service annex, returning to her brothers and her mother. As she walked away, the absolute silence in the ballroom finally broke. It started as a low, frantic murmur and rapidly escalated into a deafening roar of whispers, angry gasps, and frantic questions. The elite wedding guests of Silicon Valley were completely losing their minds. I smiled warmly as Riley reached my side, handing her a piece of chocolate from our table. "You did perfectly, my sweet girl," I told her softly, pulling her into a warm embrace, completely ignoring the utter chaos rapidly erupting across the entire luxury ballroom floor. Jason stood completely immobilized on the grand staircase, the heavy manila envelope clutched in his hands like a radioactive device. His carefully cultivated posture had evaporated. His shoulders sagged, his pristine white tuxedo jacket suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his deflating frame. The spotlight intended to highlight his triumphant groom's speech now served as a harsh interrogation lamp, exposing the beads of sweat rapidly forming on his forehead. He stared down at the red legal seal, his mind clearly short-circuiting as the reality of his 5 years of deceit crashed down upon him. He had spent half a decade convincing his new elite circle that his past was a barren wasteland, a tragic tale of an unsupportive starter wife. Now the physical manifestation of his lie had just marched across the dance floor in a custom navy silk dress, dropped a 7-figure lawsuit in his hands, and calmly walked away. The murmurs in the ballroom were escalating into a chaotic roar. Wealthy tech executives leaned across their tables aggressively, whispering to their spouses. Beside him, Courtney finally broke free from her stunned paralysis. The blissful, ignorant smile she had worn all evening contorted into a mask of absolute horror. She stepped back from Jason, putting physical distance between them, as if his deceit were a contagious disease. Her eyes darted from the heavy envelope in his trembling hands to the dark service annex where Riley had disappeared. Jason, she shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing uncomfortably through the cavernous room without the aid of a microphone. What is that? Who was that little girl? Jason opened his mouth, but only a dry, choking sound emerged. He tried to hide the envelope behind his back, a pathetic, infantile gesture that only fueled the rising panic. Give that to me, Courtney demanded. She lunged forward, her manicured hands snatching the thick packet right out of his grip. She held it up to the light, her eyes frantically scanning the bold block letters printed across the front. The legal formatting was unmistakable. In the state of California, summons for child support arrears. Courtney read the words aloud, her voice trembling so violently that the syllables shattered. $1.8 million. She looked up, her face completely drained of blood. You have a child. You told me she was sterile. You told me you were building a legacy with me. Jason reached out his hands, shaking wildly. Courtney, please, it is a lie. He stammered, his voice cracking mid-sentence. It is a prank. It is a sick, jealous prank by a bitter woman. It is not real. Courtney stepped backward again, her custom white gown tangling around her ankles. She pointed a shaking finger toward the service annex. She looked exactly like you, Jason. She had your face. Do not stand there and tell me it is a prank. Who is that child? Jason realized he was losing control of the narrative rapidly. He turned to the crowd, grabbing the heavy silver microphone from the stand with a sweaty, desperate grip. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice booming over the speakers with a frantic, forced cheerfulness. Please remain calm. This is just a terrible misunderstanding. A tasteless stunt orchestrated by someone who wants to ruin our beautiful evening. Let us just get back to the celebration. Please enjoy the champagne. He waved his free hand toward the catering staff, silently begging them to distract the wealthy guests. Nobody moved. The string quartet remained entirely silent. The waiters holding silver trays of hors d'oeuvres stood frozen against the walls. The tech executives simply stared at him with cold, calculating eyes. In the corporate world, they could spot a fraud a mile away, and Jason was currently radiating guilt. The silence was far more punishing than boos or jeers. It was the sound of complete social execution. Desperate for an ally, Jason looked down toward the VIP tables near the front of the stage. He locked eyes with Barbara and Richard. His parents were supposed to be his greatest defenders, the architects of this grand illusion. Instead, they looked entirely broken. Barbara was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white, her breathing shallow and erratic. She had spent the last hour actively trying to convince everyone that I was a crazy woman who had adopted strays. Now the entire ballroom knew the absolute truth. Richard stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He took a hesitant step toward the grand staircase, intending to intervene, but the dense crowd of angry, whispering guests physically blocked his path. The socialites who had just been laughing with them were now actively leaning away, creating a ring of isolation around their table. They were instantly contagious, untouchable outcasts in their own coveted circle. Courtney let out a guttural scream. The sound tore through the tension, raw and visceral. It was the sound of a pampered heiress realizing her fairy tale was actually a horror story. She threw the heavy manila envelope directly at Jason. The thick packet hit him hard, sliding down his white tuxedo jacket and landing with a heavy thud on the marble stairs. You lied to me, she shrieked, tears ruining her makeup. You lied to my father. You used us. Jason dropped to his knees, ignoring the microphone as it crashed to the ground with a deafening burst of feedback. He frantically gathered the legal papers, trying to shove them back into the torn envelope, but his hands were trembling too violently. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, frantically trying to bury the evidence of a slaughter he committed years ago. From the safety of table 14, I took a slow sip of my premium sparkling water. The first bomb had detonated flawlessly, tearing the foundation of his life to absolute shreds. I knew the real damage was yet to come. The true power in this room had not even spoken yet. The silence in the ballroom was shattered by authoritative footsteps. Harrison, the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Tech, and Courtney's father stepped from the dark shadows. Men of his wealth never rushed. They expected the world to wait. The whispering guests parted, creating a clear path to the staircase. Harrison moved with lethal precision, his face a mask of controlled fury. He reached the stairs and looked at the pathetic scene. Jason was on his knees, frantically trying to stuff the summons back into the torn envelope. Courtney was sobbing violently, backing away from her fraudulent groom. Harrison bypassed Jason completely. He walked straight to his daughter, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. He whispered something into her ear, and the effect was instantaneous. Courtney stopped screaming. She drew a jagged breath, pointing a shaking finger directly across the dance floor, aiming straight at me. "That is her," Courtney shrieked. "That is the desperate ex-wife he told us about. She hired those kids. She is a bitter gold-digging scam artist trying to extort us for a payout because she failed at her own pathetic life. Throw her out. Get her out of my wedding right now." Harrison turned his head, following the trajectory of his daughter's trembling finger. His calculating eyes locked onto table 14. He saw me sitting calmly by the kitchen doors, flanked by 3 perfectly disciplined 5-year-old children and his towering African-American son-in-law. Harrison did not shout. He simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers twice. It was a subtle gesture, but the security apparatus of the resort snapped to immediate attention. 4 massive men in dark suits detached themselves from the perimeter walls. They marched across the polished marble floor in a synchronized formation, heading straight for our table. The event manager scrambled out of their way. The wealthy guests leaned back in their chairs, eager to watch the billionaire's security team physically throw a disruptive peasant out into the cold night. I did not flinch. I calmly picked up a napkin and wiped a small smudge of chocolate from Mason's chin. Beside me, Jamal immediately stood up. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket and stepped squarely in front of our table. As an architect who navigated high-stakes corporate environments, Jamal knew exactly how to project dominance. The guards approached their leader, preparing to grab my arm. "Back up!" Jamal commanded, his rich voice slicing through the tense atmosphere like a steel blade. His tone left absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are not touching her, and you are certainly not laying a single finger on these children." The head of security paused, recognizing Jamal as a member of the groom's family. "Sir, please step aside," the guard warned. "We have direct orders to escort this woman off the premises immediately. She is trespassing and causing a disturbance." "She is an invited guest," Jamal countered, standing his ground like a fortress. "And if you try to drag a mother and her 3 children through a crowd of hundreds of people, I guarantee you will face a massive civil lawsuit before sunrise. Now back away." The standoff was electric. The guards hesitated, unsure how to handle a physical altercation with a family VIP. Harrison realized his security team was stalled. Gently handing Courtney off to one of her bridesmaids, the billionaire chief executive officer descended the grand staircase. He walked across the massive dance floor, his expensive leather shoes echoing ominously. The crowd watched in breathless anticipation as the apex predator of the technology industry approached the dark, discarded corner of the service annex. Harrison stopped just inches from Jamal. For a brief second, the 2 men locked eyes, a silent battle of wills between the corporate titan and the unwavering architect. Then Harrison shifted his gaze entirely to me. He looked at the midnight blue designer gown I wore, confused by the obvious wealth it projected, before his expression hardened back into pure disdain. "I do not know what kind of cheap extortionist game you think you are playing here," Harrison said. His voice vibrated with immense threatening power. "You come into my venue, you disrupt my daughter's wedding, and you wave around fake legal documents demanding a payout. You are nothing but a pathetic scavenger trying to feed off my family's success. I deal with corporate parasites like you every single day. You see money and you want a piece of it. But you made a massive miscalculation today. You brought your circus to the wrong venue." Barbara and Richard shuffled to the edge of the dance floor, hovering behind Harrison like frightened mice. Barbara was hyperventilating, her eyes fixed on Leo, terrified the billionaire would notice the striking resemblance to his future son-in-law. Please, Harrison, Barbara stammered weakly. We had no idea she was this unstable. We will handle her. We will make her leave immediately. Harrison held up a hand, silencing Barbara instantly, without looking at her. He kept his furious eyes locked entirely on me. I have the best legal team in California on retainer, he threatened. If you do not stand up right now, take your bastard children and walk out those doors, I will see to it that you are buried in so much litigation you will never see the light of day. I will ruin you financially, professionally, and personally. I will make sure you cannot afford the air you breathe. You thought you could humiliate my daughter and walk away unscathed. You are delusional. Now get out. I looked up at the billionaire. He was confident, assured of his untouchable status. He thought wealth was a shield protecting his family from the consequences of their associations. He truly believed he was the most powerful entity in this resort. He had absolutely no idea that the woman sitting in front of him had spent the last month dissecting his corporate merger piece by piece. I remained perfectly seated. I calmly crossed my legs, resting my hands neatly on the table, and fully prepared to deliver my final destruction. Harrison glared down at me with the absolute certainty of a man who could buy and sell people for sport. He waited for me to tremble, to beg to grab my children and run toward the service doors. Instead, I unclasped my leather handbag. I did not break eye contact as I reached inside. You have a highly impressive legal team, Harrison, I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm that made the security guards shift uncomfortably. I know this because my firm regularly analyzes their corporate merger contracts. We find their compliance protocols quite rigorous. It is a shame your future son-in-law does not share their respect for the law. Harrison narrowed his eyes. The sheer arrogance of my response disrupted his entire mental framework. He was used to screaming matches or immediate submission. He was not used to a woman in a custom silk gown speaking to him like a peer. What are you talking about? Harrison demanded, his tone dropping an octave. Who are you? My name is Lauren Vance, I replied smoothly. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Data Solutions. 6 weeks ago, your executive board hired my firm under a strict non-disclosure agreement to conduct a forensic audit of the subsidiary firm you are currently acquiring. You paid us an exorbitant retainer to ensure there were no financial liabilities attached to the deal. Harrison froze. The blood drained from his face as his sharp business instincts collided with his personal reality. He recognized the name of my company immediately. Vanguard was the apex predator of the corporate auditing world. That is impossible, Barbara shrieked from behind him, her voice cracking with hysteria. She is lying. She was unemployed. She is just a bitter ex-wife trying to ruin my son. Shut up, Barbara Harrison snapped without looking at her. He kept his piercing gaze locked on me. Vanguard is handling the acquisition audit. Are you telling me you are the lead investigator? I pulled a sleek, encrypted titanium USB drive from my handbag and placed it precisely in the center of the table. Right next to it, I laid down a second, much thinner manila folder. It contained the printed executive summary of my findings. I am telling you that I personally finalized the audit this morning, I said, sliding the folder closer to him. And I am formally presenting my findings to the client. Consider this a complimentary expedited delivery. Jason pushed his way through the stunned crowd of guests. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. His white tuxedo was completely soaked in sweat. Harrison, do not listen to her. Jason pleaded, his voice cracking wildly. She is insane. She fabricated those children. She is fabricating whatever is in that folder. You know me. I clearly do not. Harrison growled, holding up a hand to stop Jason from taking another step. Harrison reached down and picked up the folder. He flipped it open. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the technology industry watched their reigning king read a document that was actively dismantling his empire. I watched his eyes scan the bold, highlighted figures on the first page. I knew exactly what he was reading. Over the last 18 months, I stated loudly, ensuring my voice reached Courtney, who was standing paralyzed near the grand staircase. Your Vice President of Acquisitions has authorized 32 separate, highly fraudulent transfers. He siphoned funds directly from your corporate merger accounts, disguising them as external vendor payouts. He routed the money through a ghost entity called Blue Horizon Consulting. Jason let out a strangled gasp. He lunged forward desperately, trying to grab the folder from Harrison. Jamal reacted instantly. My brother-in-law stepped smoothly in front of Jason, planting a firm hand directly on Jason's chest and shoving him backward. Jason stumbled, nearly knocking over a tray of champagne glasses. "Do not touch the client," Jamal said, flashing a brilliant, terrifying smile. Harrison did not even look at Jason. His eyes were glued to the financial logs. "Where did the money go?" Harrison asked, his voice deathly quiet. "It bypassed domestic regulations through encrypted offshore nodes." I answered, tapping the titanium USB drive on the table. "It landed in a private numbered account in the Cayman Islands. The exact routing numbers, the matching internet protocol addresses from Jason's work computer, and the digital signatures are all secured on this drive. Total amount embezzled is $4.2 million. Courtney let out a sharp cry, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked down at her massive diamond engagement ring as if it had suddenly caught fire. The wealthy guests began muttering frantically, their previous admiration turning into pure, unadulterated disgust. They were watching a historic corporate scandal unfold live. 4.2 million, Harrison repeated, his voice devoid of any human warmth. He slowly closed the folder. "That is correct," I said. "He stole your corporate funds to purchase his new mansion, that absurd diamond ring, and likely the tuxedo he is currently sweating through. He used your money to buy his way into your family." "It was an investment," Jason screamed, completely losing his mind. He pointed wildly at me. "She set me up. She manipulated the data. I was securing our future, Courtney. I was making sure we had the lifestyle we deserved." Harrison slowly turned around to face his future son-in-law. The billionaire did not look angry anymore. He looked like a man evaluating a pest before stepping on it. "You stole from my company to buy my daughter," Harrison stated, the coldness in his tone causing several guests to step backward. "You brought a thief into my house." Barbara threw herself forward, grabbing Harrison's sleeve. "Please, Harrison, he is a good man. He just wanted to provide for Courtney. We can pay it back." Harrison yanked his arm away. "You are done." The sheer finality of those 3 words struck the ballroom with the force of a physical shockwave. Harrison stood over his future son-in-law, radiating an aura of absolute corporate destruction. Jason opened his mouth, desperately gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, trembling so violently that his expensive platinum cufflinks rattled against his wrists. "Harrison, please listen to me," Jason begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I can explain the transfers. It was a bridging strategy. I was building a safety net for Courtney. I was going to replace every single dime after the merger closed. You have to believe me. I love your daughter." Harrison did not yell. He did not curse. He simply stepped forward and swung his right hand. The slap echoed through the cavernous ballroom with a sharp, explosive crack that sounded like a gunshot. It was not a punch. A punch would imply that Harrison viewed Jason as an equal, a man worthy of a physical brawl. A slap was a disciplinary measure. It was the ultimate degrading dismissal of a subordinate pest. The sheer force of the impact spun Jason around, his feet tangled in the pristine white fabric of his custom-tailored trousers. He collapsed onto the polished marble floor, landing hard on his hands and knees. A bright red handprint instantly began to bloom across his pale, sweaty cheek. He touched his face, staring up at the billionaire chief executive officer with wide, tear-filled eyes. "You are a thief," Harrison stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried across the dead, silent room. "You are a parasite who crawled into my home, ate at my table, and smiled in my face, while secretly bleeding my company dry. You honestly thought you were smart enough to outmaneuver me. You thought you could hide $4.2 million in a Cayman Islands account and simply walk away with my daughter and my legacy." Jason scrambled backward on the marble floor, trying to put distance between himself and the towering billionaire, but there was nowhere to go. The elite guests of Silicon Valley, the very people Jason had spent years desperately trying to impress, actively stepped back. They formed a tight, impenetrable circle of condemnation around him. Nobody offered a hand to help him up. Nobody offered a word of defense. They stared at him with unadulterated disgust. Barbara let out a hysterical sob. She dropped to her knees beside her son, her expensive designer gown pooling around her on the floor. She grabbed Jason by the shoulders, pulling him against her chest. "Mr. Harrison, I beg of you!" Barbara cried, tears completely ruining her meticulously applied makeup. "He is a good boy. He made a terrible mistake. Please do not call the authorities. We will sell our house. We will liquidate our retirement accounts. We will pay back every single penny he took. Please do not send my son to prison." Harrison looked down at the weeping mother with eyes devoid of any human sympathy. "Your house and your retirement accounts will barely cover the legal fees my corporate attorneys are going to charge for dismantling his life," Harrison said coldly. "You enabled this fraud. You raised a man who abandons his own flesh and blood to chase an easy payout. You look at those 3 children sitting over there, and you tell me your son is a good boy." Harrison pointed a firm finger directly toward table 14. For the first time all evening, the billionaire chief executive officer formally acknowledged the existence of Leo Mason and Riley. The entire ballroom turned their collective gaze toward the service annex. My children sat perfectly still. Leo met the billionaire's stare with unflinching blue eyes. Mason kept his hands politely folded. Riley simply watched the chaos with the calm, observant demeanor of a seasoned auditor. I remained seated, my posture relaxed. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The execution was proceeding exactly according to the blueprint. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to throw a single insult. I simply provided the raw data, and the ecosystem of extreme wealth was doing the savage work for me. Jason realized his future father-in-law was an impenetrable fortress of rage. He frantically pivoted, crawling across the floor toward the grand staircase where his bride stood trembling. "Courtney," Jason pleaded, reaching his hand out toward the hem of her white gown. "Courtney, look at me. I did all of this for us. I wanted to give you the world. I wanted to make sure we were protected. You have to talk to him. You have to make him stop." Harrison stepped between Jason and Courtney, physically blocking the groom from reaching the bride. "Do not ever speak to my daughter again," Harrison commanded. "You do not get to use her name. You do not get to look at her. As of this exact second, you are entirely erased from this family. My security team is currently clearing out your office at the corporate headquarters. My legal team is freezing every single domestic and international account carrying your name. You are walking out of this resort with nothing but the clothes on your back." Jason let out a wretched, sobbing gasp. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the perfectly styled strands as the absolute totality of his ruin finally registered in his mind. He was losing the job. He was losing the money. He was losing the billionaire bride. And he was gaining a $1.8 million child support debt alongside a massive federal embezzlement charge. The math was inescapable. He had gambled his entire existence on a bluff, and I had just called it in front of the entire world. Jamal stood firmly in front of our table, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He leaned down slightly, keeping his eyes locked on the pathetic display unfolding on the dance floor. "You built a masterpiece," Lauren Jamal whispered softly, ensuring only I could hear him. "I have never seen a man lose his entire soul so quickly." "I did not build the trap, Jamal," I replied, my voice steady and quiet. "I simply gave him enough rope, and he gladly tied the noose himself." He thought his arrogance was a shield. He thought he could outrun his past by ignoring it. But the past always keeps the receipts. The event manager, recognizing that the wedding was officially terminated, signaled the catering staff. Waiters began quietly backing out of the room through the swinging kitchen doors behind us. The string quartet packed away their instruments. The grand celebration had instantly transformed into a corporate crime scene. The beautiful white floral arrangements now looked like funeral wreaths surrounding the grave of Jason's ambition. Harrison turned back to me. The billionaire chief executive officer nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture of pure professional respect. I acknowledged him with a slight tilt of my head. The contract was fulfilled. The data was delivered. The dominoes were falling exactly as calculated today. Jason was unraveling at an alarming speed. He stood up on shaking legs, his face a grotesque map of sweat and rage. He looked at Harrison, then at the billionaire's security detail, and finally at me. His eyes were wild, darting around the room like a trapped bird. The realization that his world was effectively vaporizing in front of hundreds of people was too much for his fragile ego to handle. He did not accept his defeat. He lashed out, fueled by pure, unadulterated entitlement. With a guttural roar, Jason lunged away from his parents and bolted across the marble floor. He was not aiming for the exit. He was aiming for me. My children gasped, their small voices ringing out in the high-vaulted space. Riley dropped the manila envelope as she scrambled backward, but Mason and Leo stood like stone statues watching their father charge with a look of cold, analytical detachment that clearly unnerved the guests watching from their tables. Jason had lost all semblance of the polished corporate executive he pretended to be. He looked frantic, his tuxedo jacket flapping behind him like a broken wing. He was coming for me, believing that if he could just silence the person holding the documents, the reality of his embezzlement would somehow vanish. I remained perfectly seated at table 14, my wineglass held steady in my hand. I did not flinch and I did not rise. I had no fear because I had no doubt about the protection I had secured. Jason was only 10 feet away when Jamal moved. The transition was so fast it felt like watching a predator strike. Jamal did not take a step. He launched himself. He intercepted Jason mid-stride, his massive frame colliding with my ex-husband's momentum with the force of a wrecking ball. Jamal did not punch him. He used Jason's own aggressive velocity against him, spinning him around with a practiced brutal efficiency that spoke of years of disciplined training. Jason hit the floor hard. The impact was sickening. The heavy sound of his tuxedo hitting the stone slab echoed through the ballroom. Jamal did not let him up. He pinned Jason to the marble, one hand firmly planted between his shoulder blades, his other hand gripping Jason's arm and twisting it behind his back in a submission hold that left no room for resistance. Jason let out a sharp, pathetic cry of pain, his face pressed against the cold floor. He struggled, thrashing his legs against the expensive tile, but Jamal was an immovable wall of muscle and resolve. "Do not even think about moving," Jamal commanded, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that commanded instant obedience. "You are not touching her. You are not touching these children. You are not doing anything today except waiting for the police." Courtney let out a terrifying, high-pitched shriek. The billionaire chief executive officer Harrison watched the scene with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He did not move to help his son-in-law. He did not ask Jamal to release him. He watched the spectacle of Jason's humiliation with the cold, detached gaze of a man who was already calculating the legal distance he needed to put between himself and this disaster. Barbara and Richard rushed forward, their expensive shoes sliding on the marble as they tried to intervene. Richard started to yell about assault and harassment, but the head of resort security stepped between them and Jamal. "Sir, stay back," the guard commanded, finally recognizing which side of the law held the leverage. "This man is being detained for threatening physical violence against a guest. If you interfere, you will be removed from the premises as well." The threat effectively silenced Richard. He stopped mid-stride, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of helplessness. He looked at his son pinned to the floor by the man he had once considered a lesser relative, and realized his family influence could not save them from this. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the very people who were supposed to be our protectors were now merely spectators to the carnage. I stood up from table 14. I did not rush over to the chaos. I walked slowly, deliberately, my midnight blue gown flowing around my ankles like liquid night. I reached the spot where Jason was pinned to the floor and looked down. He looked small. He looked diminished. The man who had spent 5 years pretending to be a titan of industry was currently groveling on the floor of a country club, pinned by the strength of a man he had looked down upon. "Look at yourself, Jason," I said, my voice cutting through his panicked breathing. "Look at where your choices have brought you. You threw away a family, you stole millions, and you forged legal documents, all to build a life on top of a mountain of lies. And now you are being held down by the very person you considered beneath you. Is this the legacy you wanted?" Jason started to weep. It was not the dignified weeping of a man caught in a mistake. It was the frantic, snotty, broken sobbing of a man who had lost his ability to manipulate his way out of trouble. I did not feel pity. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt a complete clinical indifference. He was a variable in my life that had finally been solved and removed. Jamal looked up at me, his grip on Jason never faltering. "Security has the exits covered, Lauren. The police are 10 minutes out. Harrison is already on the phone with his board of directors, scrubbing your ex-husband's name from every single Apex Tech ledger as we speak. He is being scrubbed from history." "Good," I replied. I turned to look at the guests. Hundreds of wealthy, influential people were staring. I did not care. I had the truth, I had the evidence, and I had my children. We walked toward the exit, ignoring the groans and the sobs behind us. We had arrived in a fortress, and were leaving as the victors. The chaos was only just beginning, but I was already stepping out into the fresh, beautiful air of my own future. Courtney stood at this edge of the grand staircase, her hands trembling as she clutched the lace of her bodice. The initial shock had hardened into a white-hot fury that seemed to radiate from her entire being. She watched Jason struggling against Jamal's grip on the marble floor, and finally saw the man he actually was. The charm, the tailored suits, the borrowed status, everything was gone, leaving behind a frantic, pathetic thief who had gambled with her father's empire. She did not look at him with tears or sympathy anymore. She looked at him with the cold, cutting appraisal of a woman who had been humiliated in front of the most influential people in California. She turned her back on Jason completely. The movement was sharp and final. She walked toward her father, who was still standing by the edge of the dance floor, watching the security guards monitor the situation. Courtney reached her father and grabbed his arm, her voice cold and commanding, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Daddy, tell them to stop. Tell them to take this garbage out of my sight. This wedding is over." Harrison looked at his daughter, his expression softening only for a split second before returning to his businesslike mask of stone. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to command the very air in the room. The event manager, who had been hiding behind the grand piano, suddenly sprinted forward with a tablet in hand. Within seconds, the upbeat pop music that had been playing was abruptly cut, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. "Attention," the event manager announced, her voice shaking slightly. "The ceremony is officially canceled. Please proceed to the valet area in an orderly fashion. All guests are kindly asked to depart." The ballroom erupted. It was not a chaotic scream, but the sound of hundreds of people realizing they were witnessing a catastrophic social train wreck. Guests began to scramble, eager to flee the scene before they were implicated in the unfolding scandal. They abandoned their half-finished drinks and expensive centerpieces, shuffling toward the exits with their phones held high to capture the fallout. Barbara, realizing that her son's reputation was being erased alongside her social standing, abandoned her position near the ice sculpture. She crawled across the marble, her knees scraping the cold stone, ignoring the ruin of her custom gown. She reached Courtney's feet and tried to grab the hem of her dress. "Courtney, please," she begged, her voice high and distorted by panic. "Please do not do this. It was just one mistake. My son loves you. Jason would never intentionally hurt you. We are family now. Please tell your father he is overreacting." Courtney recoiled as if Barbara's touch were made of fire. She pulled her dress away, the silk tearing slightly with the force of her movement. "Do not touch me." Courtney spat, her eyes darting between Barbara and the man currently pinned to the floor. "Your son is a criminal. He stole from my father. He lied to my face for years about his entire life. You are not family. You are con artists. You are a family of frauds, and I hope you rot in prison for what you have done to us." Richard rushed forward, his face a mottled, angry purple. He had spent his entire career cultivating the Blackwell reputation, and he could see it dissolving in real time. He tried to grab Courtney's arm, perhaps hoping to talk sense into her or silence her, but one of Harrison's bodyguards stepped firmly into his path, effectively cutting off his route. Mr. Blackwell, the guard, said, his tone devoid of any respect. "Stay back. You are officially unwelcome on this property." Richard sputtered, his face working as he tried to find a way to maintain his stature. "We have an agreement," he shouted at Harrison, who was now ignoring him entirely. "We have business ties. We have a contract. We can fix this." The CEO of Apex Tech finally turned his head, looking at Richard with the same lack of recognition he might give a discarded business plan. "The only contract we have is a termination agreement," Harrison said flatly. "My legal team will be in contact with your counsel within the hour. Do not ever speak to me again." The weight of that rejection hit Richard harder than any physical blow. He stood there deflated as he watched his social and professional world vanish. His wife was on the floor weeping and pleading with a bride who would never forgive her. His son was face down on the marble, pinned by a man who had finally decided to stop playing along. I watched from table 14, still standing with my children. My heart rate had finally returned to a steady, rhythmic pulse. The drama was reaching its inevitable conclusion. I looked at Riley, who was watching the scene with wide, observant eyes. She did not look scared. She looked like she was witnessing the natural order of the world being restored. I turned to Jamal, who was still holding Jason down. "Jamal, let him up." "The show is over," I said. Jamal eased his weight, but kept a firm, watchful hand on Jason's shoulder as he allowed the man to scramble to his feet. Jason looked absolutely broken. His white tuxedo was stained with dirt and wine, his hair was matted with sweat, and his expression was one of total, hollow despair. He looked at Courtney, then at Harrison, then at me. There was no rage left in him, only the realization that he was standing in the middle of a ballroom filled with the people he had spent years trying to impress, all of whom now viewed him as nothing more than a pathetic, thieving parasite. I walked over to the space where the groom had stood just moments before. I stood directly in front of my ex-husband. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I spoke just loud enough for the nearby guests and the cameras of the departing guests to pick up. "You wanted a legacy, Jason," I said, looking him in the eyes. "Well, here they are. Leo, Mason, and Riley. They are the only legacy you will ever have, and they are the reason you are losing everything today. The money, the status, the bride, the future, you gambled it all on the assumption that I would stay silent. You were wrong." Jason tried to stutter a response, but Barbara sobbed so loudly that his voice was drowned out. He looked defeated, staring at the floor as the security team began to shepherd the last of the guests out of the ballroom. The wedding that was supposed to shame me had become the most public, humiliating self-destruction in the history of this social circle. I turned my back on them and began the long walk toward the front exit. I did not look back. The bride was in tears, the groom was in tatters, and my children were walking beside me into a future where their father would never again dictate their worth. The ballroom had become a tomb for Jason's ambition. As I turned toward the exit, the air felt lighter, stripped of the toxic pretense that had suffocated me for years. My children fell into step beside me, their small feet rhythmic against the marble floor. Riley held her chin high, her earlier bravado now replaced by a quiet, steady maturity. Leo and Mason flanked her, protective and alert. We moved through the crowd like a phalanx. The guests who had been so eager to see me humiliated were now actively pressing themselves against the walls to let us pass. They did not want to be anywhere near the fallout of a billionaire's wrath or the legal spectacle involving my children. I paused at the edge of the grand ballroom entrance to ensure my children were ready for the final walk across the lobby. The heavy brass doors were already propped open, revealing the twilight sky over the resort. My driver was waiting by the armored vehicle, his posture professional and ready. He saw me approaching and immediately opened the door, creating a shielded path for us. I did not look back at the grand staircase. I did not need to see Jason's face to know the exact shade of gray it had turned. I did not need to witness Courtney's father calling his lawyers to know the legal hammer was about to fall. The sounds of sobbing and shouting faded into a dull hum as we stepped out onto the cool California pavement. The exterior of the resort felt peaceful, a sharp contrast to the psychological warfare we had just exited. The evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine and the distant salt of the ocean. My children climbed into the back of the armored SUV without a word, their movements efficient and calm. They were remarkably resilient, perhaps because they had spent their entire lives seeing me stand firm against the invisible pressures of our past. I slid into the seat beside them, the heavy door closing with a satisfying airtight thud that locked out the rest of the world. As the vehicle pulled away, I watched the resort vanish into the darkness. I did not feel a rush of adrenaline or a surge of triumphant joy. I felt a profound, deep-seated sense of closure. The version of me that had been discarded 5 years ago, the version that had wept in a Starbucks because she thought she had lost everything, was finally laid to rest. I had proven that my worth was never tethered to Jason, to his family, or to the distorted social expectations they had tried to force upon me. I had built a legacy that was mine alone, and tonight I had ensured that my children would never have to question their place in the world. My phone began to light up with notifications. Messages from Marcus, my lead attorney, started scrolling across the screen. Jason's offshore accounts had already been flagged by the federal authorities, alerted by the information I provided to Courtney's father. The embezzlement investigation was being fast-tracked. My civil suit for the child support arrears had been successfully processed by the court, and the liens were being filed as we drove toward the airport. Every single avenue of escape for Jason was systematically being closed. He would not just lose his bride and his reputation. He would be legally and financially dismantled. I looked at my children. They were leaning against each other, exhausted from the intensity of the day. Riley reached into her small purse and pulled out a chocolate bar I had given her earlier. She broke it into 3 equal pieces, giving one to Leo and one to Mason. They ate in companionable silence. They had no idea that they had just changed the trajectory of our entire lives, that they had stood up to a man who had chosen to forget them and forced him to confront the reality of his own greed. I realized then that they did not need to know the full extent of the horror right now. They only needed to know that we were safe and that we were together. I pulled out my phone and sent a final text to Jamal. "You saved us today," I wrote. "Thank you for being the only family member who was brave enough to stand on the right side of history." Jamal responded within seconds. "I didn't do anything but hold the door open, Lauren. You were the one who walked through it. Stay safe. I am already dealing with the aftermath here. It is an absolute bloodbath." I closed the app. The bloodbath was his family's problem now. I had removed myself from their ecosystem of misery. My father-in-law's estate, his reputation, his connection to Apex Tech. All of it was currently dissolving into liquid ash. I had the satisfaction of knowing I did not have to lift another finger. The truth, once it was armed with the right evidence, was entirely self-sustaining. It destroyed everything in its path, which was exactly how it should be. We arrived at the private tarmac, where the jet was waiting, its engines already whirring with a soft, persistent hum. The crew was ready, the flight plan filed for an immediate departure. I walked toward the aircraft, the cool wind whipping my gown around my legs. The airport, where I had been abandoned 5 years ago, had been the site of my mother's betrayal. But this private runway was the site of my liberation. I felt like a different person entirely. The woman who had been left with $200 and a shattered heart had evolved into a woman who owned her own destiny. As the jet taxied down the runway, preparing for takeoff, I looked out the window at the distant, glittering lights of the resort. Somewhere in that sprawling complex, Jason was likely sitting in a holding room, waiting for the police to arrive or for a process server to hand him the final paperwork of his life. I hoped he felt every second of it. I hoped he realized that the barren wasteland he had tried to bury me in had actually become the soil for my growth. The plane banked sharply, turning toward the Pacific. I watched the coastline until it disappeared, replaced by the vast, dark expanse of the ocean. My phone signaled one last message this time from my mother. It was a flurry of missed calls and desperate rambling texts. They were trying to reach me, trying to bargain, trying to fix what was already shattered beyond repair. I opened my phone settings and tapped the icon for block contact. One by one, I muted their voices, erased their access to my life, and deleted their history from my device. The connection was broken not just by distance, but by the weight of my own choosing. I finally felt a sense of absolute terrifying and beautiful clarity. The world was open. My children were safe. My empire was secure. I was no longer the starter wife, the failure, or the complication. I was Lauren Vance, and I was exactly where I needed to be. The month following the wedding was not a time of reflection or healing. It was a time of witnessing the total collapse of a criminal operation. I sat in my office in Seattle sipping a fresh cup of coffee and watched the headlines populate on my second monitor with the rhythm of a ticking clock. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially moved in on the acquisition firm where Jason worked. It was not a quiet behind-the-scenes investigation. It was a full-scale raid. News crews captured the images of federal agents walking out of the building with boxes of files, servers, and hard drives. Jason was the primary target, his name explicitly linked to the embezzlement of $4.2 million from the Apex Tech merger fund. The coverage was relentless. They ran the footage of his arrogant groom speech from the wedding on a constant loop, juxtaposed with mugshots of him looking pale, unkempt, and utterly defeated. The public watched in real time as his carefully constructed status symbols were stripped away. The mansion in the suburbs was seized by the court as part of the asset forfeiture. His luxury car was towed from the driveway, the repo man filmed by a local reporter with a dark, humorous grin. Courtney's billionaire father had not only canceled the marriage, but had also filed a massive civil lawsuit against Jason for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. Jason was not just broke, he was facing a prison sentence that would likely span the better part of a decade. I received an email from my lead attorney, Marcus, confirming the finalization of the divorce settlement and the enforcement of the child support lien. Jason was legally and financially bankrupt. His domestic accounts were emptied, his future earnings garnished, and his credit rating destroyed to the point where he could not even rent a studio apartment. He was a non-entity, a ghost haunting the ruins of a life built on sand. I took the satisfaction of that knowledge and archived it. I did not visit him in jail. I did not write him letters to gloat. I did not need to. The silence was the loudest victory I could possibly claim. My phone remained completely silent from the direction of Barbara and Richard. Following the public destruction of their son, they had been dropped by their exclusive country club and shunned by their former social circle. Their pride, which had always been more expensive than their bank account, had finally been paid in full. They were irrelevant, their names no longer appearing on foundation boards or charity galas. They lived in a state of perpetual quiet misery, the ultimate consequence of the values they had instilled in their golden child. I turned my attention to the foundation. The James Henderson Memorial Scholarship was already supporting 10 students, and their letters of gratitude were stacked on my desk. Each one represented a life that would not be defined by the kind of abandonment I had endured. My children were flourishing in their new school. They played, they learned, and they loved without the shadow of a father who treated them like a liability. One afternoon I sat in my garden watching the sunset over the water. It was the anniversary of my return from Singapore, the day I had almost lost everything to a frozen pipe and the indifference of a family that did not want me. I looked at the photos of James and the life we had shared, feeling the grief still present, but no longer all-consuming. I was finally at peace with the knowledge that the people who had abandoned me during my darkest moments had taught me the most important lesson of all: my value was never theirs to define. My mother called me one final time before I fully initiated the block protocol. I didn't recognize the number, so I answered. "Amelia," she whispered, her voice sounding frail and aged. "I saw the news. I saw what happened to Jason. I saw the foreclosure notices. Can't we be a family again? We're all we have left." I listened to her desperate, manipulative tone and recognized the emptiness behind it. She did not want me because she loved me. She wanted me because I was a survivor, because I had built something she could no longer control. Mom, I said, my voice steady and firm. I am not the person who needs your permission to exist anymore. We are not a family. We are just people who happen to share a history, and that history is closed. I hung up, blocked the number, and set the phone down. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I had created my own space. I had built a legacy based on love, not obligation. I had turned a tragedy into a blueprint for a life of purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought about anyone currently struggling with the toxic weight of people who refuse to see their worth. Remember that their inability to recognize your value does not change your value. Their limitations are not your future. Stand your ground, document your truth, and never be afraid to create the space you deserve. You are worthy of love that shows up when it matters most, and you are capable of building a life that is authentically yours. Thank you for listening to my journey. If this story touched your heart or helped you feel less alone, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Your story is still being written, and it is entirely yours to command. The story of the protagonist serves as a powerful reminder that our self-worth should never be held hostage by the expectations or approval of those who consistently underestimate us. Throughout the narrative, the protagonist faces systematic neglect and betrayal, yet she finds her true strength not through external validation, but through quiet, unwavering self-reliance. The most profound lesson here is that building a life on one's own terms, whether through career success or establishing firm boundaries, is not merely an act of defiance, but an act of survival. Often we remain in toxic environments because we hope that one day the people who hurt us will finally see our value and change their behavior. However, the story demonstrates that those who are emotionally incapable of providing support or respect rarely change simply because we try harder to please them. True power lies in the moment we stop waiting for an apology or a shift in their perspective and start prioritizing our own peace and purpose. By transforming her painful inheritance into a source of stability, the protagonist proves that our greatest challenges often provide the very foundation we need to rebuild our lives into something authentic and unshakable. Ultimately, we must learn to be our own biggest cheerleader, finding fulfillment in the life we create rather than the recognition we are denied. Your story is yours to write, and you deserve to define your own value regardless of what others think. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to find your true worth, share your story in the comments below.